Jacob Turner's hands trembled as he reached for Samuel Robinson's face, his thumb tracing the line of Samuel's jaw with a tenderness that spoke of months of hidden longing. The golden afternoon light streaming through the apartment window caught the uncertainty in Jacob's dark eyes, but also something else, something that had been building between them for weeks now, unspoken and electric. Samuel's breath caught it as Jacob whispered, "I don't want to assume anything, but what I'm feeling right now, is it mutual?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had been ready to cross until this very moment. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he searched Jacob's face, seeing his own desperate hope reflected there. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Samuel leaned into Jacob's touch, his voice barely audible when he replied, "God, Jacob, I've been hoping you'd ask that question for so long." The admission broke something open between them. Years of careful friendship suddenly recontextualized in the space of a heartbeat. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, with Jacob's confession trembling on his lips and Samuel's walls finally crumbling, we need to go back to where it all began to shift. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Jacob Turner had been living what most people would consider a perfectly acceptable life. He had his marketing job at a mid-sized advertising firm downtown. His small but comfortable apartment in the Arts District, with its exposed brick walls and vintage furniture he'd collected from estate sales, and his friendship with Samuel Robinson that had become the most important relationship in his world, even if he couldn't quite admit why. Jacob had met Samuel 2 years ago at a coffee shop near the university where Samuel taught literature. It was one of those hole-in-the-wall places with mismatched furniture and local art covering every available wall space, the kind of place that attracted graduate students and professors who valued atmosphere over efficiency. Jacob had been struggling with his laptop, cursing under his breath at a presentation that refused to cooperate, when Samuel had appeared at his table with an offer to help and a smile that made Jacob forget how to breathe properly. Samuel had fixed his technical problem in under 5 minutes, his long fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced ease. But they had talked for 3 hours, conversation flowing between them, like they had known each other for years rather than minutes. What had started as coffee shop encounters became regular meetups, which became movie nights at Jacob's apartment, which became the kind of friendship that made other people assume they were dating. Jacob had learned to deflect those assumptions with practiced ease, even as something deep in his chest ached every time he had to explain that they were just friends, just friends. The phrase had become a knife that twisted a little deeper each time he said it, especially when well-meaning coworkers would ask why he didn't just ask Samuel out already, clearly seeing something that Jacob was too afraid to acknowledge. Samuel Robinson taught 19th century literature at the local university and had a gift for making dead poets sound like they were speaking directly to the hearts of lovesick 21st century students. His office was a cramped but cozy space filled with towering bookshelves, literary journals stacked in precarious piles, and a collection of vintage teacups that he'd inherited from his grandmother. He was brilliant and funny and had this way of listening that made Jacob feel like the most interesting person in the world, leaning forward with genuine curiosity whenever Jacob talked about his work or his thoughts on whatever book Samuel had recommended that week. Samuel also had a boyfriend. Marcus had been in Samuel's life for 8 months, a relationship that had begun with promise but had slowly devolved into something that felt more like habit than love. Marcus worked in finance, wore expensive suits, and had opinions about wine that he shared with the confidence of someone who'd never been contradicted. Jacob had spent countless evenings listening to Samuel's growing frustrations with Marcus, offering advice and support while his own heart broke a little more each time. Samuel would curl up on Jacob's couch, running his hands through his dark hair in that way that made Jacob want to reach out and smooth the worried lines from his forehead and talk about how something felt missing. "Marcus is a good guy," Samuel would say, his voice carrying a note of confusion that Jacob had learned to recognize, the same tone he used when discussing a particularly puzzling piece of literature. "He's kind and smart and he cares about me. But when I'm with him, I feel like I'm playing a role, like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not, like I'm reading from a script I never auditioned for." Jacob would nod and make the right supportive sounds while privately cataloging every word, every gesture, every moment when Samuel seemed to be reaching for something he couldn't name. The shift had begun on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Samuel had shown up at Jacob's door, looking lost and carrying a bottle of wine, his usually bright demeanor clouded with something Jacob couldn't quite identify. His hair was damp from the rain, and he was wearing that old cardigan with the elbow patches that Jacob secretly loved because it made Samuel look like the quintessential English professor he was at heart. Marcus had canceled their dinner plans again, choosing to work late instead of celebrating Samuel's recent publication in a prestigious literary journal. It was the third time in 2 weeks that Marcus had prioritized work over their relationship, and Samuel was beginning to question whether this was the kind of love he actually wanted. "I'm sorry to just show up like this," Samuel had said, holding up the wine bottle like an offering. "I know you probably have plans, but I couldn't face going home to an empty apartment and pretending everything's fine." "Please, son, you never need to apologize for coming here," Jacob had replied, stepping aside to let Samuel in. "You know that, right? This is always a safe space for you." They had settled on Jacob's couch with the wine and a collection of old movies, but Samuel seemed distracted, his attention drifting away from the screen to study Jacob's profile in the flickering light. Jacob had been acutely aware of Samuel's gaze, the way it seemed to linger on his hands, his mouth, the curve of his neck. There had been moments throughout their friendship when Jacob had caught Samuel looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, but tonight felt different, charged with possibility. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Samuel had asked during a quiet moment between films, his voice soft and contemplative. Jacob had turned to find Samuel watching him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "Like you're going through the motions of what you think you're supposed to want, but it doesn't feel real? Like you're an actor who's forgotten they're performing?" Jacob had wanted to say yes, that he felt exactly like that every day, that he had been pretending to be satisfied with friendship while yearning for something deeper. Instead, he had asked, "What do you mean?" Samuel had been quiet for a long moment, his fingers playing with the stem of his wine glass in a nervous gesture Jacob had come to recognize. "With Marcus, I keep waiting to feel what I think I'm supposed to feel. That overwhelming connection, that sense of rightness that everyone talks about. But it's like there's this wall between us that I can't break through, no matter how hard I try." He had paused, his eyes meeting Jacob's. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm looking for the wrong things in the wrong places. Or maybe I'm just broken somehow, incapable of feeling what other people feel." "You're not broken," Jacob had said immediately, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. "Samuel, you're one of the most emotionally intelligent people I know. If something doesn't feel right, maybe it's because it isn't right, not because there's something wrong with you." The conversation had continued late into the night, touching on topics they had never explored before. Love and connection and what it meant to truly know someone. Samuel had moved closer on the couch as they talked, close enough that Jacob could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Their knees had touched and neither had moved away. "I feel like I can tell you anything," Samuel had said at one point, his voice soft with wine and honesty. "I've never had that with anyone before. Not even Marcus. Especially not Marcus." When Samuel had finally left that night, Jacob had stood in his doorway watching him walk to his car, something fundamental having shifted between them. Samuel had turned back before getting in, their eyes meeting across the distance, and Jacob had seen something in his expression that made hope bloom dangerous and bright in his chest. The weeks that followed had been a careful dance of growing intimacy and unspoken tension. Samuel began spending more time at Jacob's apartment, often showing up with takeout and staying until the early hours of the morning. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal, touching on dreams and fears and the spaces between what they said and what they meant. Samuel would bring books he thought Jacob might enjoy, reading passages aloud in his professor voice while Jacob listened with rapt attention. Jacob would share stories from his childhood, his hopes for the future, his fears about settling for a life that felt safe but empty. Jacob found himself cataloging these moments like precious artifacts, the way Samuel's hand would brush his when they reached for the same book, how Samuel had started sitting closer on the couch, their shoulders touching as they watched movies. The morning Samuel had fallen asleep during a late-night conversation, and Jacob had covered him with a blanket, studying his peaceful face in the dim light and wondering what it would be like to wake up next to him every day. "You make me feel seen," Samuel had said one evening, apropos of nothing, as they shared a pizza and argued good-naturedly about the merits of various film adaptations of classic novels. "Like you actually understand who I am underneath all the professional expectations and social obligations." Jacob had felt his heart skip at the words, but he'd kept his voice steady when he replied, "You do the same for me. I never have to pretend with you." Samuel's relationship with Marcus continued to deteriorate. The conversations about their problems became more frequent, and Jacob could see the toll it was taking on Samuel. There were dark circles under his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Jacob wanted to offer more than just a listening ear, wanted to hold Samuel and tell him that he deserved someone who would prioritize him, someone who would see how extraordinary he was. "He forgot my birthday," Samuel had confessed one evening, his voice hollow with disappointment. "Not just the celebration, but the actual day. I mentioned it at dinner, and he looked genuinely surprised, like he couldn't believe he'd missed it." "Samuel," Jacob had said carefully, his heart breaking for the pain in his friend's voice, "that's not okay. You deserve someone who celebrates you, not someone who treats you like an afterthought." The breaking point came on a cold November evening when Samuel arrived at Jacob's apartment with red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands. Marcus had forgotten their anniversary dinner, choosing instead to attend a work function that could have easily been missed. Samuel had sat alone at the restaurant for 45 minutes before giving up and driving to the one place that felt like home. "I'm done," Samuel had said the moment Jacob opened the door, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep making excuses for someone who clearly doesn't want to be with me." Jacob had taken one look at Samuel's devastated expression and pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than any embrace they had shared before. Samuel had melted into him, his face buried against Jacob's neck, and Jacob had felt the exact moment when Samuel's careful composure finally cracked. "I can't do this anymore," Samuel had whispered against Jacob's shoulder. "I can't keep pretending that this is enough, that this is what love is supposed to feel like. I feel like I'm suffocating in a life that doesn't fit me." Jacob had held him tighter, his own heart breaking for Samuel's pain, while simultaneously hoping that this might finally be the moment when everything changed. They had spent that night talking in a way they never had before, Samuel finally admitting that he had been questioning not just his relationship with Marcus, but his understanding of himself. He talked about feeling disconnected from his own desires, about going through the motions of what he thought he was supposed to want without ever stopping to examine what he actually felt. "I've been thinking about things," Samuel had said, his voice hesitant, "about myself, about what I want, about why nothing has ever felt quite right." Jacob had listened with his heart in his throat, wanting desperately to tell Samuel about his own feelings, but terrified of ruining the trust between them. Samuel was vulnerable and hurting, and Jacob refused to take advantage of that pain, no matter how much he longed to offer himself as an alternative. As the weeks passed, Samuel's relationship with Marcus officially ended, a quiet dissolution that felt more like relief than heartbreak. Samuel threw himself into his work and his friendship with Jacob, the two of them spending even more time together as Samuel navigated his newfound freedom. I feel like I can breathe again," Samuel had told Jacob one evening as they walked through the park near Jacob's apartment. "Like I've been holding my breath for months and finally remembered how to exhale." It was during this period that Jacob began to notice changes in the way Samuel looked at him, and there were moments when their eyes would meet and hold, conversations that seemed to carry layers of meaning beneath the surface. Samuel began initiating more physical contact, casual touches that lingered just a moment too long to be purely platonic. The night everything changed had started like so many others. Samuel had come over with Chinese takeout and a stack of papers to grade, settling into what had become his usual spot on Jacob's couch. They had eaten while watching a documentary about the restoration of old manuscripts, Samuel making commentary about the historical significance, while Jacob found himself more interested in watching Samuel's animated expressions than the screen. You know, Samuel had said, gesturing at the television with his chopsticks, there's something incredibly romantic about the idea of preserving these old love letters and poems. Someone centuries ago poured their heart onto paper, and here we are, still able to read their most intimate thoughts. Jacob had smiled at Samuel's enthusiasm, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about literature and history. You make everything sound like poetry, Jacob had said. Even documentary narration becomes beautiful when you explain it. After dinner, Samuel had spread his papers across the coffee table and begun grading, occasionally reading amusing excerpts aloud to Jacob. Listen to this, he'd said with a laugh. This student wrote that Emily Dickinson was probably just really bad at social media. I mean, they're not entirely wrong, but still. Jacob had been reading a novel, both of them comfortable in the familiar rhythm of shared silence. But as the evening wore on, Jacob became increasingly aware of Samuel's presence, the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, how his tongue darted out to wet his lips when he was concentrating. Jacob, Samuel had said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet, can I ask you something? Jacob had looked up from his book to find Samuel watching him with an expression that seemed almost nervous. Of course, Jacob had replied, setting his novel aside to give Samuel his full attention. Samuel had been quiet for a moment, his pen tapping against his stack of papers in a rhythm that betrayed his anxiety. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss someone of the same gender? The question had hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Jacob's heart had started racing, but he had kept his voice steady when he answered. I think most people have wondered about that at some point. Why do you ask? Samuel had looked down at his hands, his cheeks flushing slightly. I've been thinking about it lately. A lot, actually. There's something about the idea that feels, I don't know, right in a way that surprises me. The admission had sent electricity shooting through Jacob's veins, but he had forced himself to respond carefully. That's not uncommon. Sometimes our understanding of ourselves evolves as we experience more of life. Samuel had nodded, but Jacob could see there was more he wanted to say. It's not just a general curiosity, Samuel had continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It's more specific than that. Jacob had felt his mouth go dry, hardly daring to hope that Samuel might be leading where he thought he was leading. What do you mean? Samuel had looked up then, meeting Jacob's eyes with an intensity that made Jacob's breath catch. I keep thinking about what it would be like to kiss you, Samuel had said, the words coming out in a rush. I know that probably sounds crazy, and I don't want to make things weird between us, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you. About us. The confession had hit Jacob like a physical blow, years of hidden longings suddenly given voice. He had stared at Samuel, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of joke or misunderstanding, but Samuel's expression was earnest and vulnerable and completely serious. Samuel, Jacob had said carefully, his own voice shaking slightly. Are you saying that you have feelings for me? Samuel had nodded, his hands gripping the papers in his lap so tightly that his knuckles were white. I think I've had feelings for you for a long time, but I was too scared to admit it to myself. Being with Marcus felt safe because it was what I thought I was supposed to want. But with you, everything feels different, more real, more like myself. Jacob had felt like the world was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his life suddenly recontextualized. Samuel, he had said, his voice thick with emotion. I need you to know that I've been in love with you for almost 2 years. I never said anything because I didn't want to lose our friendship, but if you're telling me that you might feel the same way, then I need you to know that you're the most important person in my world. Samuel's eyes had widened at Jacob's confession, and Jacob had seen the exact moment when understanding dawned in his expression. All those times I caught you looking at me, Samuel had whispered. All those moments when I thought I was imagining something between us. You felt it too. Jacob had nodded, hardly trusting himself to speak. Every day, he had managed. Every single day I've wanted to tell you how I feel, but I was terrified of ruining what we have. Samuel had set his papers aside and moved closer on the couch, close enough that Jacob could feel the warmth of his body. "Jacob," Samuel had said, his hand reaching out to touch Jacob's face. "I don't want to assume anything, but what I'm feeling right now, is it mutual?" And that had brought them full circle to this moment, with Samuel's thumb tracing Jacob's jawline and years of careful friendship finally giving way to something deeper. "God, Samuel," Jacob had whispered, leaning into the touch. "I've been hoping you'd ask that question for so long." The admission had broken the last barrier between them, and Samuel had leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against Jacob's. "Can I kiss you?" Samuel had asked, his breath warm against Jacob's lips. Jacob had answered by closing the distance between them, their mouths meeting in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deeper as they both realized that this was real, that this was actually happening. The kiss had been everything Jacob had imagined and more, soft and sweet and full of years of suppressed longing. Samuel had tasted like the wine they had shared with dinner, and his hands had found their way into Jacob's hair, holding him close as they explored this new territory between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Samuel had rested his forehead against Jacob's and smiled. "That felt incredibly right," he had said, his voice full of wonder. Jacob had laughed, a sound of pure joy and relief. "I can't believe this is actually happening," he had replied. They had spent the rest of the evening talking about their feelings, about the moments when they had each suspected that there might be something more between them. Samuel had admitted that he had been comparing every relationship to what he felt with Jacob, wondering why nothing else ever measured up. Jacob had confessed to the countless nights he had lain awake, imagining what it would be like to hold Samuel, to wake up beside him, to build a life together. "I think I've been in denial about my sexuality for years," Samuel had said, his voice thoughtful. "Not because I was ashamed, but because I couldn't understand why nothing felt right. Now I realize I was looking for something in the wrong places." "There's no timeline for figuring yourself out," Jacob had replied. "What matters is that we're here now." As the night grew later, they had moved from the couch to Jacob's bed, not for anything physical beyond holding each other, but because neither wanted to be apart. They had talked until the early hours of the morning, mapping out the geography of their feelings and making tentative plans for what came next. "I want to take this slowly," Samuel had said, his head pillowed on Jacob's shoulder. "Not because I'm not sure, but because I want to savor every moment of this. I've waited so long to feel this way about someone." The weeks that followed had been a period of careful exploration and growing confidence. They had taken things slowly, both aware that they were navigating new territory and wanting to be sure of their footing. Samuel had moved some of his things into Jacob's apartment gradually, their lives intertwining in ways that felt natural and right. "I love having your books everywhere," Jacob had said one morning, stepping over a stack of Victorian novels to reach the coffee maker. "It makes the place feel more like home." "I love that you don't mind my chaos," Samuel had replied, wrapping his arms around Jacob from behind. "Marcus used to complain about my organizational system." "Your organizational system is perfect," Jacob had murmured, leaning back against Samuel's chest. "It's very you." There had been challenges, of course. Samuel had to have difficult conversations with friends and family about his changing understanding of his sexuality. Jacob had to learn to trust that Samuel's feelings were real and lasting, that this wasn't just an experiment or a phase. But with each passing day, their connection had grown stronger, more certain. "My mother wants to meet you," Samuel had said one evening, his voice nervous. "She's curious about the man who's made me so happy lately." "I'd love to meet her," Jacob had replied. "As long as you're comfortable with it." "I'm more than comfortable," Samuel had said, his smile warm and genuine. "I want her to know how important you are to me." Samuel had proven to be an affectionate and attentive partner, bringing Jacob coffee in bed and leaving little notes in his lunch bag. He had a way of looking at Jacob that made him feel like the most cherished person in the world, and his enthusiasm for their physical relationship had put to rest any lingering doubts Jacob might have had about Samuel's commitment. "I never understood what all the fuss was about," Samuel had confessed one night, as they lay tangled together in Jacob's bed. "Physical intimacy always felt like something I was supposed to want rather than something I actually wanted. But with you, everything makes sense now." They had established new routines and traditions, Sunday morning breakfast that stretched into the afternoon, evening walks around the neighborhood, quiet nights spent reading together on the couch. Samuel had introduced Jacob to his favorite poets, reading aloud in his professor voice while Jacob listened with his head on Samuel's shoulder. Jacob had shared his love of old movies, and they had worked their way through decades of cinema, Samuel providing historical context while Jacob supplied commentary on the cinematography. So, Samuel had said during one of their movie nights, I think I'm falling in love with you through your eyes. Seeing these films the way you see them, understanding what moves you, it's like learning a new language. You already know the language, Jacob had replied, kissing Samuel's temple. You just needed someone to practice with. Their first fight had been about something ridiculous. Jacob's tendency to leave dishes in the sink clashing with Samuel's need for order. But they had worked through it with the same careful attention they brought to everything else, talking until they understood each other's perspectives and finding a compromise that worked for both of them. I'm sorry I snapped at you, Samuel had said after they'd resolved the issue. Well, I think I'm still learning how to be in a relationship where we actually communicate instead of just avoiding conflict. We're both learning, Jacob had replied. That's what makes this real. The first time Samuel had said, I love you, had been on a snowy December morning. Jacob had been making pancakes while Samuel graded papers at the kitchen table, both of them still in their pajamas and messy-haired from sleep. Samuel had looked up from his work to watch Jacob flip a pancake, and the words had spilled out of him like they couldn't be contained any longer. I love you, Samuel had said, his voice full of certainty and wonder. Jacob had turned from the stove to find Samuel watching him with an expression of such tenderness that it had taken him his breath away. I love you too, Jacob had replied, and they had stood there grinning at each other like idiots until the smell of burning pancakes had broken the spell. By spring, they had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Samuel had officially moved in, his books mixing with Jacob's on the shelves, his coffee mug finding a permanent place next to Jacob's in the cabinet. They had hosted dinner parties for their friends, Samuel's colleagues from the university, mixing with Jacob's co-workers in conversations that ranged from literature to marketing strategies to the best places to find vintage furniture. You two are disgustingly happy, Jacob's sister had observed during one of these gatherings. It's like watching a romantic comedy, except it's real life. We are pretty disgusting, Samuel had agreed with a laugh, his arm around Jacob's waist. I'm not even sorry about it. Jacob had never been happier. He woke up each morning next to the person he loved most in the world, someone who understood him completely and loved him not in spite of his quirks, but because of them. Samuel had a way of making even ordinary moments feel special, turning grocery shopping into an adventure and dishwashing into an opportunity for dancing around the kitchen. You realize you're humming, Samuel had said one evening as Jacob washed dishes, his voice amused. Am I? Jacob had replied, not stopping his soft melody. You do it when you're happy, Samuel had observed, wrapping his arms around Jacob's waist from behind. I love that I can tell your mood by your unconscious soundtrack. Their physical relationship had developed naturally, with none of the awkwardness Jacob had feared might come from Samuel's inexperience with men. Samuel approached intimacy with the same enthusiasm and attention to detail he brought to everything else. And Jacob had discovered that being with someone who truly wanted to be there made all the difference in the world. I never knew it could feel like this, Samuel had whispered one night, his voice full of wonder, like coming home to myself. They had talked about the future in the careful way that new couples do, making plans that were tentative but hopeful. Samuel had been offered a position at a more prestigious university across the country, and they had spent hours discussing whether it would be worth the move, whether their relationship was strong enough to weather such a significant change. I don't want to hold you back from an amazing opportunity, Jacob had said, though his heart had clenched at the thought of Samuel leaving. You're not holding me back, Samuel had replied firmly. You're what I want. The job is just a job, but what we have, this is once in a lifetime. In the end, Samuel had decided to stay, telling Jacob that he had finally found the place where he belonged and wasn't interested in starting over somewhere else. The conversation had led to discussions about longer-term commitments, about the possibility of marriage and children and growing old together. I know it might seem fast, Samuel had said one evening, as they walked through the park where they had had so many important conversations. But when you know, right? I've known since the day I met you, Jacob had replied. I just didn't think I'd ever get the chance to tell you. Jacob had been amazed by how easily Samuel had adapted to thinking of himself as part of a same-sex couple. There had been moments of uncertainty, times when Samuel questioned whether he was doing the right thing or worried about how others perceived him. But those moments had become fewer and farther between as Samuel grew more confident in his identity and his feelings. I feel like I spent 30 years wearing a costume that never quite fit, Samuel had told Jacob one night. And now I finally get to be myself. One evening in late spring, as they sat on their small balcony watching the sunset, Samuel had turned to Jacob with a serious expression. I need you to know something, he had said, taking Jacob's hand in his. Before you, I was living someone else's life, going through the motions of what I thought I was supposed to want. But with you, I feel like myself for the first time in my life. I feel like I'm finally home. Jacob had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of Samuel's words and the love he could see in his expression. You are home, Jacob had replied. We both are. Samuel had leaned over to kiss him then, soft and sweet, in the golden light of the setting sun. They had been together for 8 months when Samuel had surprised Jacob with a weekend trip to the mountains, a small cabin by a lake where they could escape the city and focus entirely on each other. They had spent their days hiking and reading, their evenings cooking together and talking by the fire. This is perfect, Jacob had said on their first night, curled up next to Samuel on the couch in front of the fireplace. Just us and no distractions. I wanted to have you all to myself for a few days, Samuel had replied, his fingers combing through Jacob's hair, to remind us both of what we're building together. It had been on the last night of that trip that Samuel had brought up the subject that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. They had been lying in bed, Jacob's head on Samuel's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Samuel had been running his fingers through Jacob's hair in the absent way that meant he was thinking deeply about something. Jacob, Samuel had said quietly, what would you think about us getting married? Jacob had lifted his head to look at Samuel, seeing nervousness and hope warring in his expression. Are you asking me to marry you? Jacob had asked, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Samuel had smiled, that soft smile that Jacob had fallen in love with from the very beginning. I'm asking if you think we're ready to start talking about it seriously. I know we haven't been together very long in the grand scheme of things, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I want to build a life with you, Jacob. I want everything with you. Jacob had felt his heart swell with so much love that he thought it might burst. Yes, he had said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes to talking about it. Yes to building a life together. Yes to everything. Samuel had pulled him up for a kiss that tasted like promises and forever. They had spent the rest of the night talking about their dreams for the future, about the kind of wedding they might want, about whether they wanted children and where they might want to live. Every conversation had felt like another brick in the foundation they were building together, solid and sure and meant to last. I want something small, Samuel had said. Just our families and closest friends. I want it to be about us, not about putting on a show. That sounds perfect, Jacob had agreed. I just want to marry you. Everything else is just details. The drive home from the mountains had been quiet but comfortable, both of them lost in thoughts about the future they were planning. Jacob had watched Samuel drive, noting the relaxed set of his shoulders, the easy smile that played around his lips. This was Samuel at his happiest, Jacob realized, confident and secure in their relationship and excited about what came next. Back in the city, they had fallen back into their routines with a new sense of purpose. Samuel had started wearing a simple silver ring on his left hand, not quite an engagement ring, but a symbol of their commitment to each other. Jacob had done the same, and they had both taken quiet pleasure in the way it felt to have that visible reminder of their connection. People at work keep asking if we're engaged, Jacob had told Samuel one evening. I love being able to say almost. Almost engaged to the love of your life, Samuel had replied with a grin. I like the sound of that. They had begun the process of legally combining their lives, adding Jacob's name to Samuel's lease, opening joint bank accounts. updating their emergency contacts and beneficiaries. Each step had felt significant, another way of declaring to the world that they were a team, a unit, a family of two. Samuel's colleagues at the university had been universally supportive, many of them commenting on how much happier he seemed since he had started dating Jacob. His family had taken longer to come around, but they had eventually welcomed Jacob warmly, his mother commenting that she had never seen Samuel so settled and content. "I was worried when he told us about you," Samuel's mother had confided to Jacob during their first family dinner. "Not because you're a man, but because Samuel has always been so hard on himself, so quick to doubt his own happiness. But watching him with you, I can see that he's finally found his place." Jacob's own family had embraced Samuel immediately, his sister joking that she had been wondering when Jacob would finally find someone worthy of him. Samuel had charmed Jacob's parents with his intelligence and his obvious devotion to their son, and Jacob had loved watching Samuel relax into the warmth of his family's acceptance. "Your parents are wonderful," Samuel had said after their first holiday gathering. "They made me feel like I've always been part of the family." "You have been," Jacob had replied. "Well, they've been waiting to meet you for 2 years, even when I didn't know I was waiting to introduce you." As summer turned to fall, they had started seriously planning their wedding. Nothing elaborate, just a small ceremony with their closest friends and family, followed by a reception in the garden of Samuel's favorite restaurant. Samuel had thrown himself into the planning with characteristic enthusiasm, researching venues and caterers and flower arrangements with the same attention to detail he brought to his academic work. "Oi, I found the perfect florist," Samuel had announced one evening, bursting through the door with brochures and price lists. "Oh, she specializes in seasonal arrangements, and she has these amazing ideas for incorporating books into the centerpieces." "Books in the centerpieces?" Jacob had asked, amused by Samuel's excitement. "Think about it," Samuel had said, spreading the materials across their dining table. "We could use vintage poetry collections, maybe some first editions from the university library. It would be so us." Jacob had been content to let Samuel take the lead on most of the decisions, more interested in the marriage than the wedding itself. But he had insisted on writing his own vows, spending weeks crafting words that could somehow capture the depth of his feelings and his gratitude for the love they had found together. What are you writing over there?" Samuel had asked one evening, finding Jacob hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table. "Wedding vows," Jacob had replied, "and they're terrible. How do you put 2 years of love into a few paragraphs?" "You don't," Samuel had said, settling into the chair next to him. "You just promise to keep loving for the next 60 years and trust that everyone will understand." The night before their wedding, they had stayed in separate apartments according to tradition, even though it felt strange to sleep apart after so many months of sharing a bed. Jacob had lain awake thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point, from that first meeting in the coffee shop to tomorrow's ceremony that would officially make them husbands. He had thought about all the moments that had led them here, the conversations and confessions, the growing intimacy and deepening trust. He had thought about Samuel's courage in questioning everything he thought he knew about himself, his willingness to risk everything for the chance at real love, and he had thought about his own patience and faith, the way he had loved Samuel quietly for so long without expecting anything in return. "Tomorrow I marry my best friend," Jacob had texted Samuel just before midnight. "Tomorrow I marry the love of my life," Samuel had texted back. "Sweet dreams, almost husband." The wedding itself had been perfect in its simplicity. Samuel had looked stunning in his dark blue suit, his eyes bright with joy and love as he watched Jacob walk down the aisle. Their vows had been personal and heartfelt, promises to support each other's dreams and weather whatever challenges life might bring. "Jacob," Samuel had said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "you taught me what it means to be truly known and loved. You waited for me to find myself, and then you helped me become the person I was always meant to be. I promise to love you with the same patience and devotion you have shown me for all the days of my life." When the officiant had pronounced them married, Samuel had kissed Jacob with such enthusiasm that their guests had burst into applause and laughter. They had danced their first dance to a song that Samuel had chosen, something about finding home in another person's arms, and Jacob had felt like the luckiest man alive. The reception had been everything they had hoped for, intimate and joyful, filled with the people who mattered most to them. Samuel's best man had given a speech about watching Samuel transform from someone who seemed to be sleepwalking through life to someone who was fully awake and engaged with the world. Jacob's sister had talked about the way Jacob lit up whenever he talked about Samuel, how obvious it had been to everyone that this was the real thing. To Jacob and Samuel, she had concluded, raising her glass, who proved that the best love stories are worth waiting for. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Jacob and Samuel had stolen a quiet moment together on the garden terrace. The string lights twinkled overhead, and the scent of jasmine filled the air as they held each other close, still hardly believing that they were actually married. "I can't believe we did it," Samuel had whispered against Jacob's ear. "We're actually married." Jacob had pulled back to look at his husband, still getting used to the word, and had seen his own wonder reflected in Samuel's expression. "Best decision I've ever made," Jacob had replied, and Samuel had kissed him again, soft and sweet and full of promise. Their honeymoon had been 2 weeks in Europe, a trip they had planned together with careful attention to both of their interests. They had spent time in London exploring museums and theaters, in Paris walking along the Seine and visiting bookshops, in Italy eating incredible food and marveling at centuries-old art. "I love traveling with you," Samuel had said one morning as they sat at a cafe in Rome, sharing pastries and people-watching. "You notice things I miss, and you make everything feel like an adventure." "That's because it is an adventure," Jacob had replied. "Every day with you is an adventure." But Jacob's favorite moments had been the quiet ones, mornings spent drinking coffee on hotel balconies, evenings walking hand in hand through ancient streets, nights falling asleep in each other's arms in beds that weren't their own, but felt like home because they were together. They had returned to their regular life with a deeper sense of connection and commitment. Marriage hadn't changed the fundamental dynamics of their relationship, but it had added a layer of security and permanence that both of them treasured. They were no longer just partners or boyfriends. They were family, bound together by law and love, and the promises they had made in front of everyone who mattered to them. "I love being married to you," Samuel had said one morning as they got ready for work, catching Jacob's eye in the bathroom mirror. "I love having a husband." "I love being your husband," Jacob had replied, turning to kiss Samuel properly. "I love everything about this life we've built." Samuel had settled fully into his identity as a married gay man, no longer questioning or second-guessing his feelings. He spoke openly about his journey of self-discovery, often helping other people who were struggling with similar questions about their sexuality or relationships. His confidence and happiness had inspired several of his friends to examine their own lives more honestly. "You saved my life," one of Samuel's colleagues had told Jacob at a faculty party. "Not directly, but watching Samuel find his happiness gave me the courage to leave my own unsatisfying relationship. He's like a walking advertisement for authentic living." Jacob had found a new level of contentment in their married life. The anxiety that had plagued him during their early relationship, the fear that Samuel might change his mind or realize he had made a mistake, had finally faded. Samuel's commitment was absolute and unwavering, demonstrated not just in words but in 1,000 small actions every day. They had started talking seriously about children, exploring their options for adoption or surrogacy. Samuel had always wanted to be a father, and Jacob had discovered that the idea of raising children with Samuel filled him with excitement rather than fear. They had begun the preliminary steps of the adoption process, attending information sessions and meeting with social workers. "I think we'd be good parents," Samuel had said one evening as they reviewed adoption paperwork. "We're patient, we communicate well, and we have so much love to give. I can't wait to see you with kids," Jacob had replied. "You're going to be an amazing father." As their first wedding anniversary approached, Jacob found himself reflecting on the incredible journey they had taken together. From that tentative question about mutual feelings to this life they had built together, every step had felt both inevitable and miraculous. Samuel had become not just his husband, but his best friend, his closest confidant, his partner in every sense of the word. They had weathered their first year of marriage with grace and humor, learning to navigate the small irritations and larger challenges that came with building a life together. Samuel's tendency to leave books everywhere had clashed with Jacob's need for order, but they had found compromises that worked for both of them. Jacob's occasional moodiness had required Samuel to learn new ways of offering support and space. Marriage is like a dance, Samuel had observed one evening after they'd successfully navigated a minor disagreement about vacation planning. Well, you have to learn each other's rhythm and figure out how to move together without stepping on each other's toes. I like dancing with you, Jacob had replied, pulling Samuel into his arms for an impromptu waltz around their living room. But through it all, their fundamental connection had remained strong and sure. They still talked for hours, still laughed together every day, still felt that spark of attraction and desire that had drawn them together in the first place. If anything, their physical relationship had deepened and improved as they became more comfortable with each other and more skilled at communicating their needs and desires. I love how we fit together, Samuel had murmured one night as they lay tangled in their bed, the city lights filtering through their bedroom window. Not just physically, but in every way, like we were made for each other. Maybe we were, Jacob had replied, tracing patterns on Samuel's chest. Maybe we spent all those years as friends so we'd be ready for this when the time was right. On the morning of their anniversary, Jacob had woken up early to watch Samuel sleep, still amazed that this brilliant, beautiful man was his husband. Samuel's face was peaceful in the early morning light, his dark hair mussed against the pillow, and Jacob had felt that familiar surge of love and gratitude that had become as natural as breathing. Samuel had stirred as the sunlight grew stronger, opening his eyes to find Jacob watching him with a soft smile. "Good morning, husband," Samuel had said, his voice rough with sleep but warm with affection. "Happy anniversary," Jacob had replied, leaning down to kiss him gently. They had spent the day recreating their first official date, visiting the art museum where they had wandered for hours talking about everything and nothing, then having dinner at the small Italian restaurant where Samuel had first admitted his feelings. It had been a perfect day, simple and romantic, and full of the easy companionship that had always been the foundation of their relationship. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" Jacob had asked over dessert. Thinking back to that pivotal evening when everything had changed, "I asked if what I was feeling was mutual," Samuel had replied with a smile. "Best question I ever asked." "Best answer I ever gave," Jacob had said, reaching across the table to take Samuel's hand. That evening, as they sat on their couch with glasses of wine and a photo album from their wedding, Samuel had turned to Jacob with that serious expression that meant he had something important to say. "You know, a year ago I was terrified that I was making a huge mistake, that I was destroying the best friendship I'd ever had for the sake of something that might not work out. But sitting here now, I can honestly say that marrying you was the smartest thing I've ever done." Jacob had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of love he could hear in Samuel's voice. "You saved my life," Jacob had replied. "I was so lost before you, going through the motions but never really living. You taught me what it means to be truly happy, to be completely myself with another person." Samuel had set down his wine glass and pulled Jacob into his arms, holding him close as they both marveled at the love they had found and nurtured together. As they prepared for bed that night, Jacob had caught sight of their reflection in the bathroom mirror. Two men who had found their way to each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Samuel had appeared behind him, wrapping his arms around Jacob's waist and resting his chin on his shoulder, and Jacob had seen their future stretching out before them, full of possibility and promise. "I love you," Samuel had whispered against Jacob's neck, the same words he said every night, but somehow made new by the depth of feeling behind them. "I love you too," Jacob had replied, turning in Samuel's arms to kiss him properly. And as they made their way to the bed they shared, Jacob had thought about how perfectly they fit together, how natural and right their love felt, how grateful he was that Samuel had found the courage to ask that crucial question about mutual feelings. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, Jacob thought as he drifted off to sleep in his husband's arms. Sometimes the love you've been looking for your whole life is right there beside you, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And sometimes all it takes is one person being brave enough to ask if what they're feeling is mutual, and everything changes forever.